Okay, welcome to Fair and Focus, where we take the female, women, and girl athlete injury prevention consensus papers, or FAIR consensus papers, as people like to call them, and we try to make them useful for athletes, coaches, clinicians, researchers, anyone. Really, anybody who doesn't want to sit there and read a full systematic review over their morning coffee. I mean, I don't mind doing that, and maybe Emily doesn't mind doing that, but a lot don't. So today, it's our inaugural show. And we're talking about upper extremity injury prevention in female, women, and girl athletes. And I've got the pleasure of doing this with Emily Hemming. And Emily's on the screen there. Hello, Emily. Emily is the lead author of the FAIR Upper Extremity Systematic Review. She is a PhD student in the Sport Injury Prevention Research Center in the Faculty of Kinesiology at the University of Calgary under the supervision of Dr. Carolyn Emery and Dr. Catherine Schneider. Emily, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Let's get right into it. So why did this review need to get done? I mean, I think a lot of people assume, an injury is just an injury. And why do we need to focus specifically on female, women, and girl athletes?
Yeah, that's a great starting question. And that's exactly the assumption that we're trying to challenge a little bit with these reviews. So an injury might look similar on paper, but the context around the injury can be really different. The female, women, and girl athletes may have different sport environments, training histories, rules, even in the same sports, or different coaching, access to medical support, equipment, and strength and conditioning resources.
Right.
So the issue is not just do women get shoulder injuries, because of course we know that that's true.
Yeah.
The bigger question is whether the risk factors and prevention strategies that we use are based on evidence that applies to them.
Okay.
So a lot of the upper extremity injury prevention evidence has either come from male athletes, some sort of mixed sample, or studies that include female athletes but don't report the results separately. And so that makes it hard to know what is truly relevant to these female, women, and girl athletes.
Right.
So this review was needed to kind of pull together what we actually know, but also show where the evidence is still thin.
Right. And that would be something that's consistent across all the FAIR work that's been done, right?
Like yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not just the upper extremity, but all of the reviews that were done.
Right. And so, like, for those who aren't familiar with it, like a systematic review, what is that, and like what's involved in that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long process, I will say that, and it's a lot at the start. So we searched 8 databases. And through those databases, we found just over 16,000 records.
Wow.
And so we went through multiple steps of screening, and we narrowed down those 16,000 records to 55 studies, which are the 55 studies that we used in this review.
Okay.
And so of those 55 studies, 20 of them looked at prevention strategies and 35 looked at modifiable risk factors.
Okay. And
then across all of those studies, we had just over 33,000 athletes. Just over 8,000 of them were female, women, and girl athletes. So only about 26% of the sample was included. But yeah, that's kind of the process. You start with a big search and you pull out thousands and thousands of records, and you go through multiple steps of screening to narrow it down to the papers that are really relevant to the questions that you're trying to answer.
Wow. Okay. And did you do this alone, Emily, or what? Like, no?
Absolutely not. There's a huge team of authors. I can't remember the exact number on my review, but there are many authors across the world that were involved in this process and really helped, because there's no way I could look at 16,000 studies myself. So there was a big team and for my study, but as well as for all of the studies involved in the FAIR consensus.
Oh, that's cool. So the global effort.
Yes, absolutely. I think in the full consensus, we had over 100 authors involved. So it was a big process for sure. And it happened over a year, or longer than a year, to go through the full process.
Okay. So before we kind of dive into any of the details and key takeaways, like what counts as an upper extremity injury? And where do we see those injuries happen on the body?
Yeah, good starting off with that. And so upper extremity is really anything related to the arm. So we've got the shoulder, the elbow, forearm, wrist, hand, even fingers. And in sport, the injury patterns really depend on the demands of the sport. So you can kind of break it up into overhead sports, which is where a lot of shoulder injuries and elbow injuries occur. So that could be things like volleyball, handball, swimming, softball, and baseball, even cricket. Those are a lot of overhead throwing sports,
Right.
a lot of involvement of the shoulder and the elbow.
Hmm.
And then you can also think of sports like maybe gymnastics, where it's a lot of weight bearing through the arms. And so there might be more hand and wrist injuries involved with that.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so with this review, we probably shoulder was the most commonly studied injury location. Doesn't
Mm.
mean that every sport has the same upper extremity injury pattern, but it does tell us that the evidence is concentrated around shoulder injuries, especially in sports with repeated overhead demands. So
Right.
those volleyball and handball sports.
Right. And some racket sports, I would imagine too, right?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure, for
Yeah.
sure.
Um, so the paper itself talks about a 51% reduction in shoulder injuries amongst some female women and girl athletes who use I think the paper calls it a shoulder focused exercise intervention. That seems pretty significant, is it?
Yes, so it's definitely one of the most positive and practical findings from the review.
Okay.
So the pooled results from 3 studies suggested that shoulder-focused exercise programs reduce shoulder injury rates by 51% in these female, women, and girl handball and volleyball athletes.
Okay.
So it's encouraging because these programs were not overly complicated. It's not something that's going to be difficult to implement in daily activities. So they included things like shoulder strength, stability or control, and sport specific exercises. So, in volleyball, there's already a lot of overhead shoulder exercises that you do in your warm up. And so keeping it sport specific is really important.
Hmm.
And so, from a practical standpoint, these are the types of exercises that could potentially be built into warm ups or regular training pretty easily.
Okay.
But I think it's also important to have a little bit of caution around it. I think
Hmm.
you mentioned that there's the certainty of evidence was very low around this 51% reduction. So I would
Right.
say it's not that the case is closed and that it definitely works for everyone. I'd say
Hmm.
the evidence is promising, especially for shoulder injuries in overhead sports.
Hmm.
But it supports the idea that structured shoulder strength and control work is probably a worthwhile prevention strategy.
Right.
But we need more high quality studies in more sports and age groups to be able to hang our hat on this result across a wider group of athletes.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, before we came on the air, we did have a quick conversation about that in that sense that, some might look at this and say, well, you've got such a small pool of data that you're pulling from here. It doesn't give me a lot of certainty about those results. So I think your point about, that more needs to be done is really a key takeaway, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. In the same vein, the paper also touches on parasport athletes and kind of the paucity of information that's really, research data that's available for those athletes. Does this, in your perspective, require definitely some more attention in the future? Or?
Yes, very much so. So this is one of the clearest gaps in the review that
Okay.
we found. So despite the fact that shoulder injuries are a major concern in wheelchair athletes, I mean, you can imagine in any wheelchair sport, most of the demand is coming through the shoulder and upper extremity.
Mm.
But we didn't find any prevention strategies that assessed upper extremity injury prevention in female, women, and girl para athletes.
Okay.
There's only one study that we had for limited risk factor evidence in. So it matters because para athletes may have very different sport specific demands and risk factors,
Sure.
and things like their equipment, their chair setup, propulsion mechanics, transfer demands, training volume, classification. There's so many different things that you have to consider with para athletes that can influence upper extremity load.
Mm.
And for many wheelchair athletes, the upper extremity is not just important for their sport, but it's also essential for their daily mobility and
Totally.
independence. And so it's a bigger issue than just in sports. So yes, the space needs special attention. We can't just take evidence from non-para athletes and assume it fully applies to them.
Yeah.
We need research that is designed with para athletes and not just applied to them afterwards. Kind of like we're saying for female athletes, we can't just take what's been done in male men and boy
Yeah.
athletes and apply it to female athletes. It's the same thing with para athletes. We can't just take the evidence that we have for female, women, and girl athletes and apply it to these para athletes,
Yeah.
but we need para specific evidence for these female, women, and girl para athletes.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Okay. Let's get real here for a moment. Not that this isn't real, but wait, no, let's get real. Let's get real. I'm a high school girls volleyball coach. The season's coming up. I mean, I'm not a kinesiologist. I'm not a professional coach. I'm a teacher maybe in a school. What do I need to be thinking of in terms of preventing upper extremity injuries in my athletes as I look forward to the season?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that's really important for coaches to be able to take something away from this review and be able to actually implement it in their daily lives and with
Hmm.
their athletes. And so for a high school girls volleyball team, I would focus on keeping it simple,
Yep.
consistent, and specific to the shoulder demands of volleyball and to the sport. So based on the review, I think the most practical thing would be to include shoulder focused exercises in the warm up or regular training routine.
Okay.
So as I mentioned before, this can include shoulder external rotation strength, scapular control, some trunk control, and volleyball specific movements.
Hmm.
I think the key with, especially with high school girls, the key is to be realistic. If it's something that's going to take 45 minutes, it's probably not going to happen. And
Right.
the girls are not going to want to do it.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
you can build in probably 5 to 10 minutes a few times per week and make it part of their normal warm up, this is
Hmm.
something that's much more feasible.
Right. How, you know, and we've talked about this idea of things like effective warm-ups, like neuromuscular training warm-ups. Um, but I know in talking with some other, strength and conditioning coaches, they're like, well, that's not, it's one thing, but it needs to kind of be a full, I don't know if the word's cocktail, but like a full kind of package of different things that coaches need to be, whether it's volleyball or any sport, you need to be thinking about your warm-ups, you need to think about strength training, you need to be thinking about nutrition, frankly, and lots of things, right? Would you say that that's probably true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think no matter the sport, it's not just going to come down to one thing that's going to prevent the injuries for
Sure.
your athletes. You have to think about all the different demands of the sport and everything that goes into
Yeah.
keeping your athletes safe.
Right. Right. I mean, as a former varsity athlete yourself, golf, I mean, I'm sure you've had your share perhaps of some injuries to shoulders, right?
Yeah, yeah, with myself, but also teammates. So
Yeah.
definitely something you need to be continuously working at
Okay.
throughout the sports. Yeah.
Okay, we talked about, and I don't want to. I mean, it's a big paper. It's a lot of work. I don't want. We've got a short time, but like, we've talked about gaps. What would you say, speaking to me and colleagues, would be one of the biggest gaps to kind of address looking forward?
Yeah, to me, the biggest gap is the sex and gender disaggregated reporting. So we
Okay.
need studies that report results separately for female, women, and girl athletes. And this sounds kind of simple, and
Mm,
why isn't this being done? But it does make a huge difference. So in
sure.
this review, all of the papers that we included, we had 55 studies, and all of them included female, women, and girl athletes. But
Hmm.
only 31% of those studies reported female, women, and girl specific estimates. So that means
Mm,
that we may be losing useful information simply because it's not reported in a way that lets us interpret it.
got it. Okay.
And then after that, I would say we need more high quality prevention studies designed specifically for female, women, and girl athletes across more sports, more injury locations, and more populations, including those para athletes that we've talked about.
Got
Right
it.
now, much of the evidence is concentrated around the shoulder and around a few sports, so we need to
Mhm.
definitely broaden that. So those would be kind of the two biggest gaps that I would say from this review.
Okay. So we talked about gaps. Again, let's make it real for people, coaches, clinicians, parents, athletes. And in your best effort, how would you boil down kind of the one key takeaway message about upper extremity injuries for the broader population? What would you say?
Yeah, the key take home message is that shoulder focused exercise programs, especially those including strength, stability, or control, and sport specific exercises, are a promising strategy for reducing shoulder injuries in female, women, and girl athletes,
Okay.
particularly in those overhead sports like handball and volleyball.
Right.
But if I could add a second, I know you said one, but if I could add a bigger message, is that the evidence is still very limited. So
Right.
female, women, and girl athletes are underrepresented. Results often don't report separately for those athletes, and there are major gaps for para athletes and for injuries beyond the shoulder. So we
Right.
have something practical to act on right now with those shoulder focused exercise programs,
Okay.
but we also have a clear call to improve the quality and the inclusiveness of future injury prevention research.
Wow. Okay. Amazing. Thank you, Emily. This has been great. And, thank you for being the first participant in our Fair and Focus series. So kudos to you for doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for having me.
of course. So, as I said, this is our first show on upper extremity injuries. Tune in the future. I know this is so captivating. You will want to tune in the future when we focus on another one of the FAIR systematic reviews. So until next time, thanks for joining us, and we'll speak to you then. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Mark.